The prairie dusk bled into the sky like bruises left by memory. Jonas Callahan rode silent, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a dust-stained coat, the reins slack in one gloved hand. The other hand never strayed far from the iron at his hip. Behind him, seated awkwardly on the weather-worn saddle, a girl clung to his waist, her arms thin as willow branches, her face turned slightly toward the sound of crows crying overhead. She was young, Apache, blind. Her name was Tiva. He didn't ask. She had told him once, softly, and only once. Jonas had found her 2 days prior, sitting on the back stoop of the saloon with a crust of bread cupped in both palms. Her shawl was torn. Her feet were bare. She hadn't flinched when the barkeep dumped mop water near her legs. She only tilted her chin toward the sun and sat still, like she was waiting for someone long dead to return. The townsfolk had seen him walk over, seen him kneel, heard nothing, and when he'd hoisted her gently onto the back of his horse and ridden out toward the hills, they'd leaned on their fences and muttered that the old soldier had finally gone crazy. Let him talk. The cabin came into view as the last sun spilled gold across the snow. It sat crooked against a backdrop of distant hills, the porch slanted, chimney cracked, windows dim. Jonas hadn't lit a lamp in weeks. Not since the last winter came early and nearly took his fingers. He dismounted with the grunt of an old tree groaning in wind, then turned and helped her down, carefully, respectfully. She stood barefoot in the snow, her lashes thick with frost. Her milky eyes looked to the east as if she saw fire rising. She didn't speak. Jonas led her inside. The door creaked open to the smell of old wood, soot, and ash. A rifle leaned in the corner beside a pair of worn boots. Hooks along the wall still held a bonnet and a child's mittens, long untouched. The prairie dusk bled into the sky like bruises left by memory. Jonas Callahan rode silent, his broad shoulders hunched beneath a dust-stained coat, the reins slack in one gloved hand. The other hand never strayed far from the iron at his hip. Behind him, seated awkwardly on the weather-worn saddle, a girl clung to his waist, her arms thin as willow branches, her face turned slightly toward the sound of crows crying overhead. She was young, Apache, blind. Her name was Tiva. He didn't ask. She had told him once, softly, and only once. Jonas had found her 2 days prior, sitting on the back stoop of the saloon with a crust of bread cupped in both palms. Her shawl was torn. Her feet were bare. She hadn't flinched when the barkeep dumped mop water near her legs. She only tilted her chin toward the sun and sat still, like she was waiting for someone long dead to return. The townsfolk had seen him walk over, seen him kneel, heard nothing, and when he'd hoisted her gently onto the back of his horse and ridden out toward the hills, they'd leaned on their fences and muttered that the old soldier had finally gone crazy. Let him talk. The cabin came into view as the last sun spilled gold across the snow. It sat crooked against a backdrop of distant hills, the porch slanted, chimney cracked, windows dim. Jonas hadn't lit a lamp in weeks. Not since the last winter came early and nearly took his fingers. He dismounted with the grunt of an old tree groaning in wind, then turned and helped her down, carefully, respectfully. She stood barefoot in the snow, her lashes thick with frost. Her milky eyes looked to the east as if she saw fire rising. She didn't speak. Jonas led her inside. The door creaked open to the smell of old wood, soot, and ash. A rifle leaned in the corner beside a pair of worn boots. Hooks along the wall still held a bonnet and a child's mittens, long untouched. Her shawl hung over the railing now, dripping snowmelt. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, hands folded tight. A blind Apache girl in his house. He hadn't thought it through. Didn't need to. He'd seen her shoulders, hunched for more than cold. Seen the way the town looked past her like she was already bones. He didn't know what made him stop. He only knew he did. And something about the silence between them, the way she didn't beg, didn't weep, didn't flinch, it reached a place in him that war, loss, and winter had long since closed. From the barn came the low, rhythmic grunt of the mare bedding down. A storm was coming. He smelled it in the dark. the kind that left fences flat and trails vanished. He reached for the pipe he hadn't smoked in years. Lit it slow. Inhaled. Held the smoke in his lungs like it might hold back the ache in his ribs. There was no plan. No promise. Just a fire, a cabin, and two people too broken to say what they needed. Sometimes the soul doesn't need words. Just warmth. Just stillness. Just time. The days fell into rhythm. Not soft, not sweet, but steady. Jonas woke early, as he always had. The land gave no mercy and asked for none. There was always something to mend. The fence sagging near the ridge, the creek dammed by branches, the roof where wind had peeled shingles like scabs. He worked with the same silence he carried in war, one task at a time, never thinking too far ahead, never pausing long enough to remember. Tiva remained mostly inside. She walked the cabin like someone learning it in the dark, which for her, it always was. One hand slid lightly along the walls, the other outstretched in front of her. She moved barefoot, the soft thud of her steps barely rising above the creak of old wood. She found the stove, the wash basin, the shelf where he kept the tin cups. She rarely spoke. At first, Jonas assumed she didn't know English. But he caught small things, the way her head turned when he spoke, how her brow creased when he muttered to himself. She understood. She just chose silence. At night, when he lay on the cot by the fire and pretended to sleep, he'd hear her voice. Soft, singing or praying, it was hard to tell. The words were Apache, the tone full of ghosts. She'd speak in long, gentle murmurs, her voice trembling near the end. Names, maybe. Apologies. Farewells. He never asked. He figured everyone deserved a place to speak to the dead without interruption. One morning, he found her kneeling beside the hearth, her fingers working a small braid of dried grass. It looked like a child's toy, a doll, perhaps, or an offering. She tucked it beside the ashes, then placed a stone over it. Jonas didn't ask what it meant. Some things were meant to remain sacred. But he remembered something from long ago, stories he'd heard about mourning braids and bundles placed for the spirits of those taken too soon. Later that day, she found a rocking horse. It sat in the corner beneath a dusty quilt, long untouched. He didn't know how she reached it, whether the light from the window warmed the wood just enough for her to sense it, or if her steps simply wandered too far. But when he heard the sound, the creak of that rocker, the soft gasp, he froze. She ran her fingers over it slowly, reverently. The edges were charred from fire long ago. One ear had broken clean off. Still, she traced it with care, her face tilted as if remembering something from her own life, far from here. Jonas stood in the doorway, hand on the frame, the breath caught hard in his throat. The sight of her touching what once belonged to his daughter. It was like watching two ghosts pass in the same room. He turned away, stepped outside, lit a cigarette he didn't want, and stared out across the cold fields. Tiva didn't flinch. Her head remained high, face turned into the wind, like she was listening to something no one else could hear. But Jonas flinched, and that surprised him. He clenched his fists until the veins stood out pale beneath sun-browned skin. He didn't yell, didn't chase the boys. He only looked around, long and slow, and every man who met his eye turned away. They made a home just before dusk. Jonas unsaddled the mare, then came inside. Tiva was already sitting near the fire, head tilted, listening to the crackle. Without a word, he took the quilt off the bed and laid it over her shoulders. She didn't speak, but she reached up with one hand and rested it on his forearm, just for a second. And in that second, the ghost between them sat still. The sky hung heavy with snow, a colorless weight pressing down on the prairie. Wind whispered through brittle stalks and whistled through the rafters. Jonas stood on the porch with his coat drawn tight and a look in his eyes like he'd seen this kind of winter before, the kind that buried horses standing up, the kind that took a man if he paused too long between steps. Supplies were low, flour nearly gone, the last of the beans soaked in a pot the night before. He strapped the saddle tight, laid an old blanket over the mare's back to keep the wind from cracking her spine. Tiva stood beside the door, her hands clutching her shawl, white eyes lifted toward the wind. "I won't be long," Jonas said, not expecting a reply. "You know where the water is. Stove's lit. Rifle's there." He nodded to the hearth. She didn't nod, but her fingers tapped once against her leg, a signal of understanding, maybe. Jonas hesitated. For the first time, he felt the distance between the cabin and town like a chasm, not a ride. Still, he mounted up and rode into the wind. The snow fell sideways by the time Harlan Dade saw the cabin through the trees. He was half drunk, as usual, a trapper from a northern edge of nowhere, with bloodshot eyes and fingers like gnarled bark. Folks said he hated everyone, but he saved a special fire in his belly for half-breeds and heathen trash. When he saw the shadow in the cabin window, small, wrapped in a shawl, walking slow, he grinned like a man spotting a fawn limping in open range. He didn't knock. Inside, Tiva stirred the fire with careful hands. The wind had changed. The silence around the cabin had become too deep, like something was holding its breath. She moved to the window, felt along the edge where the glass had grown cold. Then she stepped back. The rifle stood where Jonas left it, beside the hearth, tall and still like an old friend. She reached for it. Her fingers shook. She had never fired one. Maybe her father had, once. Maybe her brother. But she remembered the shape, remembered the sound. She knelt beside it, wrapped her hands around the worn wood, and tilted her face to the sky as if listening for her ancestors in the storm. Her lips moved in prayer, low and steady, the syllables falling like feathers. Then the door burst open. Snow flurried in with the shape of a man, tall and wide, with a grin that twisted his face in places words never reached. Harlan Dade stepped inside, boots thudding. The door slammed shut behind him on a gust, snuffing the light for just a breath. He raised his shotgun, but Tiva didn't move. The blast roared just as the wind slammed the door again, swinging it shut. The buckshot tore into the wall, missing her by inches. Sparks leapt from the stove where lead struck iron. Still, she didn't scream. She reached behind her, into the stove's mouth, where coals glowed like the hearts of wild beasts. Her fingers wrapped in cloth, she drew one ember out like a gift. Then, fast, fierce, she hurled it. It landed in the curtains. Flame raced upward, like it had been waiting all its life to be born. Harlan cursed, flailing at the cloth as it swallowed him in smoke. A boot struck the hearth. The rifle clattered to the floor. Tiva crawled under the table, coughing, pulling her shawl over her mouth. He ran, tripped over the threshold, fire biting at his sleeve. Screaming curses into the snow, he vanished into the white. Tiva crawled toward the back door, choking on smoke. She flung it open, fell into the drift, her breath heaving, face pale, lashes thick with frost. She rolled herself toward the barn by instinct, hand over hand through the snow. The dog, old Max, half-deaf but loyal, met her halfway and curled around her like a furred wall. Jonas saw the smoke long before the cabin. His heart dropped into his boots. He kicked the mare harder than he ever had. The snow fought every hoof, but she made it. When he crested the ridge and saw the back half of the roof black with soot, his chest burned like he'd been shot again. He leapt from his saddle before the horse stopped, rifle drawn. Tiva, nothing. Then, near the barn, a movement. He ran, saw her there, half buried in snow, curled like a child beside the dog, hair caked in ash, lips pale, but alive. He felt his knees, tore off his coat, wrapped her in it. Tiva, he whispered, the name like gravel breaking loose in his throat. Tiva. She stirred, only faintly. Her hand reached out and found his chest, then stopped there, like she recognized the beat of a familiar heart. He carried her into the barn, lit the lantern, laid her on hay, and wrapped her in every blanket he owned. He brought the kettle, warmed snow into water, fed it to her a spoon at a time. Her breathing steadied. Her face returned to color. Only then did he go back to the cabin. He stared at the burned wall, the shattered door, the blackened curtains. He found a coal-stained cloth she'd used to handle the ember, and near the table, a single footprint not theirs, heading east. Let him run. Jonas didn't care about revenge. He cared about the girl who didn't scream, who stood her ground, who lit fire to save herself. That night, in the barn, he wrapped her in the only thing he'd kept of Maria's, a quilt hand-stitched with roses and pine cones. A wedding gift never used since. He pulled it over her shoulders as she slept, then sat beside her, watching the storm pass, firelight flickering on the rafters. He didn't pray, but he whispered her name again, like a promise. The fire left only a blackened corner and a smoke-stained wall, but something unspoken had shifted inside the cabin, and inside Jonas himself. It began with small things. He swept the ashes. She refolded the quilts. He brought a sack of corn from a cellar. She found the grinder by sound and placed the kernels in by feel. Her hands moved with the precision of memory, not sight. Slow, sure, like she'd done it long before, in a home that no longer stood. Jonas watched from the table, his coffee cooling between his fingers. He didn't speak much, and she still spoke no English. But when he tapped the rim of the cup twice, she understood, and brought the tin kettle, carefully poured, her brow furrowed in concentration. That morning, she hummed while sweeping. A low tune, more breath than melody, but it stayed in the walls like sunlight caught in old wood. Later, when she burned her hand on the stovepipe, Jonas reached for the lye jar, but she shook her head and instead took a leather pouch from her belongings. Inside were crushed herbs, finely ground. She placed a pinch in her palm, added snow melt, and dabbed the salve on her own skin. He watched, said nothing, but the next time his old shoulder ached, he gestured toward her pouch. She understood. They sat near the hearth that evening, the dog curled between them, the firelight soft as breath. She counted the creaks in the rafters aloud in Apache. He didn't know the words, but the cadence calmed him. Then the wolf howled, a long, rising note from deep in the hills. Jonas straightened, hand near his rifle. Tiva didn't flinch. She reached out, slowly, and her fingers touched his cheek. They lingered there, featherlight, searching, then trailed to his jaw. Jonas didn't pull away. He only closed his eyes. The next day, he brought her a piece of seasoned oak and a carving knife. At first, she didn't understand. Then he took her hand, guided it to the wood's grain, and mimed walking. She smiled, the first smile he'd seen from her. Together, they carved. A crooked staff formed beneath their hands, the top curved like a question mark. She ran her fingers along its length, feeling every groove. That evening, as he tended the fence, she returned the gift. A braid of her hair, tightly bound, tied with red thread, placed gently on the mantel beside his rifle. He froze. She bowed her head, hands pressed together. A gesture of meaning. He didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but he didn't move it. He just looked at it for a long time. The town, however, was not as quiet. Harlan Dade came limping into the saloon 2 days after the fire, half his beard singed, face wrapped in gauze. He told anyone who'd listen that she tried to kill him. Called her a witch, said Jonas was harboring trouble. The sheriff rode out the next morning. Jonas saw the dust trail long before the knock. Won't be long, the sheriff said, glancing past him into the dim cabin. But I need to speak plain, Jonas. You know the law's thin out here. Folks don't want trouble. Jonas folded his arms. She's just a girl. She threw fire at a man. She was alone. He broke in. The sheriff sighed. I'm not saying what she did was wrong. I'm saying folks don't care. Harlan's stirring up men. You're outnumbered. Jonas didn't answer, just nodded. The sheriff leaned forward. If anything else happens, anything at all, there'll be no trial. You understand? Jonas watched the man ride away. That night, he added a second latch to the door, one higher up, where her hands could find it too. Later that week, snow fell in hushes, and the nights stretched longer. Jonas sat sharpening his blade by the hearth. Tiva sat beside the fire, legs folded, humming again. Her staff leaned against the wall. The braid of hair still rested by the rifle. The dog sighed. Outside, wolves answered one another across hills older than anyone remembered. Inside, it was still. She leaned against the wall, head tilted back, then turned to face him. She said a word. He didn't know it. She repeated it, soft, steady. He set the blade down. Is that your real name? She shook her head. He waited, then pointed to himself. Jonas. She smiled, pointed her own chest. Tiva. He nodded. Tiva. The fire popped. She reached toward the kettle. He beat her to it. poured her a cup, passed it without words. They sipped in silence. Not strangers anymore. Not quite. Just two souls with stories too heavy to carry alone, warming their hands in the same fire. Spring came slow that year. He taught her to shoot next. He hung tin cans along the fence post and ran a rope from her hand to each mark, letting her trace the distance by tension. At first, her grip was stiff, her breath too fast. But he stood behind her, adjusting her stance gently, and whispered, "Let the sound guide you, not the fear." Her first shot missed. Her second grazed the can. By the sixth, it clattered to the dirt. She didn't smile, but her chin lifted. That night, by the fire, he asked her something he'd been holding in his chest for weeks. "Why don't you ever scream?" The question floated between them like ash. She stirred the kettle, waited. Then finally, in a voice so low he almost missed it, "Already screamed once," she said. "It cost me everything." Jonas didn't speak again. He only watched her shadow flicker across the far wall, long and quiet, and still carrying the shape of grief. But something inside him, something rusted shut, began to warm. The next evening, they sat in the field, backs against a stump as sun spilled gold across the prairie. Tiva braided blades of grass, her fingers moving without thought. Jonas lit his pipe, letting the smoke rise slow as the wind. He glanced at her. The last rays of light clung to her cheekbones, caught in her lashes, shimmered on the scar near her jaw. "You see more than most sighted folk," he murmured. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. 3 days later, Jonas went to draw water from the well. He carried a rusted bucket, same as always, boots heavy from morning chores. The land was quiet, humming with bees and far-off birdsong. He just dropped the bucket down when he felt it, a shift in the air behind him, a shadow that didn't belong. He turned. Harlan stood 10 paces off, 2 other men flanking him. One held a rope, another a club. Jonas's hand moved to his belt, too slow. Harlan spat. "You always were a damn fool, Callahan. Taking in trash, letting it live under your roof." Jonas didn't speak. Harlan moved closer. "Town's watching. They're tired of your silence." Still, Jonas said nothing. One of the men lunged. The blow caught him behind the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. He staggered. The second man grabbed his shoulder. And then, a sound split the wind. A rifle's crack, sharp and clean. A bullet punched the sky. Above them, not near, but loud enough to shake every bird from every tree. The men froze. On the ridge, near the cabin, stood Tiva, Jonas's rifle in her hands. Hair braided, shawl pinned, her bare feet on the rock. She didn't aim again. She didn't have to. She had heard everything, from the door to the well, each voice, each footfall. She'd counted the seconds, felt the earth thud with their weight. She'd follow them, and she'd stop them. The men scattered. Harlan cursed, limped back toward the ridge. "You'll regret this, Callahan," he shouted. "You think that girl's safe? She ain't." Jonas stood, one hand braced on the well, the other over his ribs. He didn't answer, but when he looked up at her, rifle gripped steady, breath slow, something passed between them. Not words, not even thanks, just the deep, raw knowing of one soul who'd protected another. That night, the fire burned lower than usual. They sat without speaking. She traced the grain of the rifle with careful fingers before setting it down, right where it always lived. He poured 2 cups of coffee, passed one to her. She reached for it without flinching. Outside, the town slept uneasy. But inside the cabin, in the quiet, in the slow ache of bone and memory, fire stirred. Not the kind that destroys, the kind that heals. The morning came pale and cloudless, the kind that made dust feel like silk and sunlight like truth. Jonas buttoned his cleanest shirt, warm but steady. He tied his boots tight, the same way he had before every battle, every grave he dug. But this time, he looked over his shoulder, and she was there. Tiva stood in the doorway, wrapped in the faded blue shawl he'd once folded away for good. Her braid was long now, woven with dried prairie grass. And at its end, a small red ribbon fluttered like fire. He offered her his arm. She took it. They rode into town in silence, the the wagon wheels grinding against stone and spring soil. Every clatter echoed. Every bird seemed to watch. The town was already gathering. Not many spoke, but their stares gathered like kindling, dry and ready. Some leaned on porch rails. Others crossed their arms as if to hold back judgment. The preacher stood by the chapel, hands folded like he'd been expecting this day. And near the blacksmith's shed, Harlan waited, a bandage still raw on his neck, hate sharper than ever in his eyes. "She don't belong here," he barked. "You bringing that savage back after what she done?" Jonas stepped down from the wagon. His legs ached, but his voice didn't falter. "She saved my life." The sheriff stepped forward, hat in his hands, dust on his boots. "You vouch for her?" Jonas looked at the crowd, at the church bell that hadn't rung in years, at the faces that once smiled at his wife, that cried at his daughter's funeral, and never spoke his name again. He nodded. "Edo." There was a silence, a long one, then a voice, small, high, clear as birdsong. A little girl stepped out from behind her mother's skirt, a ribbon clutched in her fingers, red like dawn. She walked straight to Tiva and held it out. "For your braid," she whispered. Tiva hesitated. Then, gently, she bent forward and let the girl tie it on. The crowd shifted. No more shouting, no more spit, just stillness. The preacher said nothing. The sheriff tipped his hat, and Harlan turned and walked away. On the ride home, the prairie opened before them. The wagon creaked. The sky stretched wide and blue, and Tiva's head rested against Jonas's shoulder like it had always belonged there. Her fingers brushed the edge of his coat, and when the wind lifted her braid, now adorned with 2 red ribbons, it danced like a banner in the air. He looked down at her, eyes closed, face calm, and for the first time in decades, he let himself exhale all the way down to his ribs. They passed the cottonwood tree just before the fork in the trail, the one where, years ago, he'd carved his wife's name. The bark had aged, grown rough with seasons. Her name was still there, though the lines had softened. He stopped the wagon. Tiva stirred, sensing the change in rhythm. "What is it?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Jonas helped her down, hands steady beneath her arm. He led her to the trunk, placed her palm on the carving. She traced it, slowly. "Emma," he said. Tiva nodded. "She's still here." He unslung his knife. Just below Emma's name, he carved again. Not big, not boastful, just enough to be known. "Tiva." She didn't speak, but when he turned, her fingers brushed his chest, then lifted to his cheek. Her touch lingered there. Not a question, not a thank you. Just presence. That night, they didn't build a big fire. Only enough to warm the soup and light the room. Jonas read aloud from an old journal, the one he used to keep locked in a box beneath the floorboards. His voice was rough but steady. Tiva sat across from him, humming softly under her breath, braiding dried corn husk into little dolls for the windowsill. Outside, the prairie sang, not with thunder, not with war cries or mourning, but with wind through the grass, the hoot of an owl, the quiet creak of a rocking chair on wood. He leaned back, arms folded, eyes closed, and when her braid brushed his arm, red ribbon trailing like the end of a long story, he smiled. Sometimes the world gives no answers, no justice, no peace. But sometimes, if you're lucky, it gives you one quiet miracle, braided in red, walking home beside you, eyes closed and heart wide open.